They had been taught that capture meant death. Not a quick death, but something slower, crueler, designed to break the spirit before the body gave out. The Japanese nurses huddled in the frozen bunker had heard the stories. American soldiers were savages who showed no mercy, especially to women. Now, with the howling Alaskan blizzard growing stronger outside and their supplies exhausted, the 15 women waited for the end they had been promised would come. What happened next would shatter everything they believed about the enemy. But before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you appreciate learning about these forgotten moments of World War II history, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be remembered. It was February 1944, on the frozen island of Attu in the Aleutian chain of Alaska. The battle here had ended months before, one of the bloodiest in the Pacific theater. Japanese forces had fought to nearly the last man in what Americans called a hopeless defense. What few knew was that among the Japanese military personnel stationed on this godforsaken island were 15 women, nurses from the Imperial Japanese Army Nurse Corps. These women were not ordinary nurses. They had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments imaginable, tending to wounded soldiers in the most remote and hostile environment of the war. Attu was a place where the cold could kill as efficiently as any bullet, where winds reached speeds that knocked grown men off their feet, and where the fog was so thick you could not see your hand in front of your face. The nurses had endured months of this, working in underground bunkers that offered little protection from the elements, treating frostbite, gangrene, and wounds infected by the constant damp. When the Americans launched their assault to retake Attu in May 1943, the Japanese command made a decision that would seal the fate of thousands. Rather than surrender, they ordered a final banzai charge. The nurses were told to remain in the bunkers, to tend to the dying, and when the Americans came, to take their own lives. It was the expected thing. It was the honorable thing. To be captured was worse than death. But the nurses never had the chance to carry out those orders. The battle ended in chaos. Communication lines were cut, officers were killed, and in the confusion, the 15 women found themselves trapped in a bunker that had been overlooked during the American sweep. For months, they survived on scraps, on melted snow, on hope that rescue would come. It never did. Their own military had forgotten them, or perhaps assumed they were already dead. The bunker became their tomb, or so they thought. Day after day, they rationed the dwindling supplies. A single can of rice might last 3 days if divided carefully. Water came from melting snow over a small fire, made from broken furniture and scraps of paper. The smoke had nowhere to go, so it filled the bunker, stinging their eyes and coating their throats. They coughed constantly, deep rattling coughs that spoke of lungs damaged by cold and smoke. At night, they huddled together for warmth, their thin bodies offering little heat, but providing comfort through proximity. They sang songs from home, soft melodies about cherry blossoms and spring rain, about mothers waiting and lovers departed. The singing kept them sane, gave them something to focus on besides the gnawing hunger and the bitter cold that seeped into their bones no matter how many layers they wore. Some of the younger nurses had never left Japan before this assignment. They had grown up in Tokyo or Osaka, in warm houses with families who loved them. They had chosen nursing out of duty, answering the emperor's call for volunteers to serve the wounded. They had imagined themselves as heroes, tending to brave soldiers in clean field hospitals. The reality was so far from that dream that it seemed like a cruel joke. Here they were, forgotten in a frozen bunker, their youth slipping away with each passing day. The American patrol that discovered them was not looking for survivors. By February 1944, Attu was considered secure. The 7th Infantry Division had long since moved on to other battles. What remained was a skeleton crew of soldiers assigned to weather station duty and cleanup operations. It was miserable work. The island was a frozen wasteland where the wind never stopped and the snow fell sideways. Soldiers counted the days until rotation. Corporal James Mitchell from Ohio was part of a 4-man team sent to check a series of Japanese bunkers that needed to be demolished. Standard procedure. They expected to find nothing but frozen corpses and abandoned equipment. Mitchell was 24 years old, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. Before the war, He had planned to study engineering at Ohio State. Now he spent his days trudging through snow, cataloging the remnants of battles fought by men long dead. The first two bunkers held exactly that: bodies stiff as boards, rifles rusted beyond use, crates of spoiled rations. The smell was terrible, but they were used to it by now. Death had a particular odor in the cold, less putrid than in warmer climates, but somehow more final. But the third bunker was different. As they approached, Mitchell noticed something odd: steam, thin wisps of it rising from cracks in the entrance. He raised his hand, and the patrol stopped. In this cold, steam meant heat. Heat meant life. Mitchell's finger moved to the trigger of his rifle. They had been warned about holdouts, Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender and would attack without warning. Just last month, a patrol had been ambushed by 3 soldiers who had been hiding in a cave for 6 months. 2 Americans died before the holdouts were killed. Mitchell did not want to be the third. He motioned to Private Chen to go left, while he and Sergeant Davis moved to the right. The fourth man, Private Kowalski, provided cover from a position behind a snowdrift. Chen was the oldest of them, 32, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese. His family had fled Shanghai when the Japanese invaded in 1937. He had personal reasons to hate the enemy, reasons that made his hands shake when he held his rifle. Sergeant Davis was from Alabama, a career soldier who had seen action in North Africa before being transferred to the Pacific. He was tough, competent, and deeply practical. He did not hate the Japanese particularly, but he did not trust them either. Kowalski, the youngest at 20, was still green, still believing in clear lines between good and evil, right and wrong. The war had not yet complicated his worldview the way it had the others. The entrance to the bunker was partially collapsed, blocked by snow and ice. Mitchell had to crouch to see inside. He clicked on his flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness. What he saw made him freeze. Eyes. Dozens of them, staring back at him from the shadows. Not the eyes of soldiers ready to fight, but eyes filled with something else. Terror, and something more. Hope, desperate and fragile. "Don't shoot," Mitchell yelled. Though he didn't know if anyone inside understood English, he kept his rifle raised but did not fire. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system. This was the moment where things could go terribly wrong, where a misunderstanding could lead to death. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. Behind him, he heard Chen moving into position, heard the click of Davis's safety being released. Slowly, figures emerged from the darkness. Women, thin, hollow-cheeked, wrapped in ragged blankets and torn military coats. They moved like ghosts, their faces blank with exhaustion. Mitchell had seen plenty of horrors in this war, but the sight of these women, barely alive, barely human in their suffering, hit him harder than any combat. These were not soldiers. These were victims, casualties of a war that had consumed everything in its path. One of the women stepped forward. She was older than the others, perhaps in her 30s, with gray streaking her matted black hair. She wore the remains of a nurse's uniform beneath a Japanese army coat several sizes too large. Despite her condition, she carried herself with dignity, with a bearing that spoke of training and discipline. She bowed, a formal, precise gesture that seemed absurd in the circumstances. Then she spoke in halting, broken English. "We are nurses. Please. Mercy." The word hung in the frozen air. Mercy. Mitchell lowered his rifle. Behind him, Sergeant Davis let out a low whistle. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "They've been here the whole time." Mitchell did not know what to do. His orders were to secure the bunkers, not to deal with prisoners, especially not female prisoners, especially not prisoners on the verge of death. The manual said nothing about this situation. There was no protocol for rescuing enemy nurses who had been forgotten by both sides. But he knew one thing for certain: they could not stay here. The temperature was dropping. A blizzard was coming. He could feel it in the way the wind had changed, in the heavy gray clouds piling up on the horizon. The barometer had been falling all morning. Anyone with experience on Attu could read the signs. They had maybe 2 hours before the storm hit, and when it did, visibility would drop to 0. Anyone caught outside would die. How many? Davis asked. Mitchell counted. 15 women, all in similar condition. Malnourished, frostbitten, some barely able to stand. One woman sat against the wall, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. Another had bandages wrapped around her hands, black with old blood. A third was shivering violently despite being wrapped in 3 layers of coats. They needed medical attention immediately. They needed food, water, warmth. They needed everything. "We need to call this in," Chen said, already reaching for the radio. But when he tried, all he got was static. The radio was dead. Maybe the cold had killed the batteries. Maybe the mountains were blocking the signal. Either way, they were on their own. Mitchell felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. This was his decision, his responsibility. If he made the wrong choice, people would die. Mitchell made a decision. "We take them back to base. Now." Kowalski's eyes widened. "Sarge, base is 8 miles. Through this?" He gestured at the darkening sky, the wind already picking up speed. "These women can't walk 8 miles. Hell, we'll be lucky if we can make it." Mitchell knew he was right. 8 miles in good weather was a long hike. In a blizzard, it would be a death march. But the alternative was leaving them here, and that was not an option he was willing to consider. Davis stepped closer, his voice low. "Mitchell, think about this. We got 4 men, 15 prisoners, and a blizzard coming. The odds are bad. We might not make it. And if we don't, that's 4 American soldiers dead for the enemy." He was not being cruel, just practical. It was the calculation every soldier learned to make. Risk versus reward, us versus them. Mitchell understood the logic, but he also understood something else. "They're not the enemy," Mitchell said quietly. "Not anymore. Look at them. They're just people who need help. And if we leave them, we're no better than the bastards who forgot them here." Davis held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right then. Let's do it." Chen checked his rifle, adjusted his pack. Kowalski looked terrified but determined. They were going to try. The nurses understood enough to know they were being rescued, though the word rescue felt strange to them. They had been taught that Americans would torture them, defile them, parade them as trophies. Yet here were these soldiers, looking at them not with hatred but with something that resembled pity. The oldest nurse, whose name was Yuki, tried to organize the others. She spoke in rapid Japanese, and slowly the women gathered what few possessions they had: a medical bag, a torn blanket, a photograph. One carried a small wooden charm, carved by a soldier who had died months ago. Yuki had been a nurse for 12 years before the war. She had trained in Tokyo, at one of the finest hospitals in Japan. She had delivered babies, set bones, held the hands of dying patients. She had thought she understood suffering, but nothing in her training had prepared her for Attu. She had watched women under her care die from starvation, from cold, from diseases that should have been treatable. She had held them as they cried for their mothers, as they whispered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned this frozen island. And through it all, she had maintained discipline. She had kept the nurses working, kept them focused on their duties, kept them from falling into despair. But now, facing these American soldiers, she felt her control slipping. This was the moment she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Rescue meant survival, but it also meant surrender, and surrender meant shame. In her mind, she heard her father's voice: death before dishonor. But looking at the young women under her care, some barely 18 years old, she made a choice: life, whatever the cost. Mitchell and his men did what they could. They shared their rations, though there was not much to share. Hard biscuits that tasted like cardboard, chocolate bars that were so frozen they had to be broken with rifle butts, water from their canteens, though it was already starting to freeze. The women ate slowly, as if the food might disappear if they rushed. Some cried as they ate, tears running down their hollow cheeks. Yuki insisted on sharing everything equally among the 15. Not a crumb was wasted. As they prepared to leave, Mitchell realized the true scope of the problem. 3 of the women could not walk at all. Their feet were black with frostbite, swollen and useless. The tissue was dead, though the women were too weak to feel much pain anymore. 5 more could barely shuffle, each step an agony. Only 7 had the strength to attempt the journey on foot, and even they would struggle. "We'll have to carry them," Davis said quietly. It was not a question. It was a fact. 4 soldiers, 8 miles, 15 women. The math did not work, but they would make it work. They fashioned crude stretchers from tent canvas and broken rifles. 2 women could be carried on each stretcher if they were small enough, which most of them were. Malnutrition had shrunk them to the size of children. Mitchell distributed the weight as evenly as possible. He and Davis would carry one stretcher, Chen and Kowalski the other. The walking wounded would follow, roped together for safety. Yuki would lead that group, setting the pace, keeping them moving no matter what. Before they left, Mitchell took out his compass and checked their bearing. Base was northwest, 8 miles across rough terrain. In good weather, they could make it in 3 hours. In a blizzard, if they made it at all, it would take 5 or 6. He looked at the sky. The clouds were darker now, lower, moving fast. Snow had started to fall, light flakes that danced in the wind. Soon, those flakes would become a wall of white. They needed to move now. The blizzard hit 20 minutes into their journey. One moment, visibility was perhaps 50 yards. The next, it was nothing. The world became white, howling, disorienting. Snow blew horizontal, stinging exposed skin like needles. The temperature, already brutal, plummeted further. Mitchell felt his face going numb, felt ice forming in his eyebrows and mustache. His hands, even in gloves, began to lose feeling. This was how people died on Attu. Not from bullets, but from the cold that crept in and stole life 1 degree at a time. Mitchell had tied a rope to each person, creating a human chain. Without it, they would have been separated and lost within minutes. Even with it, he could barely see the person directly in front of him. The wind was so loud it drowned out all other sound. He could not hear Davis behind him, could not hear the women. He could only feel the tension on the rope, could only trust that everyone was still there, still moving, still alive. Corporal Mitchell carried the first woman on his back. She was small, perhaps 90 pounds, but in this cold with this wind, she felt like she weighed twice that. Her arms wrapped weakly around his neck. He could feel her shivering against him, her breath shallow and rapid against his ear. Each breath was a cloud of vapor that froze instantly. Every step was a battle. The snow was knee-deep in places, deeper in the drifts. His legs burned. His lungs screamed for air. The thin atmosphere of Attu made every breath feel insufficient. But he kept moving. One step, then another, then another. Behind him, Davis carried another woman, this one unconscious. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her arms hanging limp. Davis had served in North Africa, had marched through the Sahara in heat that killed men. He had thought that was the worst environment imaginable. He had been wrong. The cold was worse. In the desert, you died quickly. Here, death was slow, insidious, creeping into your bones until you just wanted to lie down and sleep forever. Chen and Kowalski took turns with a third woman, switching every 10 minutes because that was all the strength they had. Chen's face was a mask of determination, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He knew these odds. He had done the math. 4 men, 15 women, 8 miles, negative 20 degrees with wind chill, 0 visibility. This was suicide. But he also knew that if they turned back now, those women would die. And despite everything, despite the war, despite what the Japanese had done to his family in China, he could not abandon them. It went against everything he believed about himself. The other nurses followed, those who could walk supporting those who could not. Yuki was everywhere, moving up and down the line, speaking softly in Japanese, encouraging, demanding, refusing to let anyone give up. She pushed when they needed pushing, held when they needed holding, and always kept them moving forward. Mitchell did not understand her words, but he understood her tone. It was the voice of someone who had already survived the impossible and was not about to fail now. It was the voice of a leader, and he found himself drawing strength from it. The first hour was hell. The wind cut through their clothes like knives. The snow found every gap, every opening, worked its way inside until they were wet and freezing. Mitchell's feet went numb first, then his hands, then his face. He could no longer feel the woman on his back except as a weight. He could not tell if she was still shivering or if she had stopped, and stopping meant she was dying. He wanted to check on her but could not spare the energy, could not stop moving even for a second. The second hour was worse. Mitchell lost all sense of direction. The compass was useless in the blizzard, the needle spinning wild. He navigated by instinct and memory, trying to remember landmarks that were now buried under snow. At one point, he was certain they were lost. The fear was a cold weight in his stomach, heavier than the woman on his back. If they did not find shelter soon, they would all freeze to death. He imagined being found in spring, a line of frozen bodies roped together, testament to a rescue attempt that failed. Then Chen shouted. He had found something. A ravine, offering a break from the wind. It was not much, but it was enough. They huddled there, packed together for warmth. The soldiers formed an outer ring, their bodies blocking the worst of the wind for the women. No one spoke. Speech required energy they did not have. They just breathed, in and out, watching their breath crystallize in the air, trying to preserve heat, trying to stay alive. Mitchell could hear his heart pounding in his ears, could feel every muscle in his body screaming for rest. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they had to move again. Staying still meant freezing to death. The cold was insidious. It made you want to sleep, made it seem like rest was the answer. But rest was death. Mitchell knew this. He had seen men die from hypothermia before, had watched them simply sit down and refuse to get up, had seen the strange smile that came over their faces as they drifted into unconsciousness. It looked peaceful, but it was murder by cold. Mitchell hoisted the woman back onto his back. Her shivering had stopped. That was bad. When the shivering stopped, hypothermia was setting in. The body was conserving energy for vital organs, shutting down everything else. He needed to move faster, but faster was impossible. Every step was agony. His shoulders screamed. His back felt like it was breaking. His feet were numb inside his boots. And he wondered if he was getting frostbite, if he would lose toes like these nurses had. It seemed a small price to pay if they survived. Kowalski fell, just collapsed into the snow like a puppet with cut strings. Chen grabbed him, hauled him up with strength that surprised them both. "I can't," Kowalski gasped. "I can't do it. I'm done." His face was white, his lips blue. Mitchell could see him giving up, see the light fading from his eyes. Mitchell turned, fighting against the wind and his own exhaustion. Through the swirling snow, he could barely see the younger soldier's face. Kowalski was 20 years old, from Chicago. He had a girlfriend named Mary, who sent letters that smelled like perfume. He had shown Mitchell her picture once, a pretty blonde with a bright smile. "Yes, you can," Mitchell said. Not encouraging, not sympathetic, just stating a fact. "You will, because if you don't, you die here. And so does everyone tied to you. Is that what you want? You want Mary to get a letter saying you died in the snow because you gave up?" It was harsh, brutal even, but it worked. Something sparked in Kowalski's eyes. Anger, maybe, or shame, or just the primal will to survive. He struggled to his feet, grabbed the rope, and kept moving. And somehow, impossible as it seemed, he found the strength to continue. One of the walking women collapsed next. She simply sat down in the snow, her face blank. The wind whipped her hair across her eyes, but she did not seem to notice. Yuki crouched beside her, speaking urgently in Japanese. The woman did not respond. Her eyes were open but empty, staring at nothing. Yuki slapped her, hard across the face. The crack was lost in the wind, but the effect was immediate. The woman blinked, focused. Yuki grabbed her by the coat, pulled her face close, said something fierce and demanding. Whatever it was, it worked. The woman nodded, let Yuki pull her to her feet, and they kept moving. Mitchell was stunned by the older nurse's determination. She was as exhausted as any of them, probably more so given her age and condition. But she refused to stop, refused to let anyone else stop. She moved through the group like a force of nature, checking on each woman, speaking words of encouragement or command as needed. At one point, she came to Mitchell, looked him in the eye, and said in broken English, "We survive? Together? No one left." Mitchell nodded, unable to speak, and felt a surge of respect for this woman who refused to surrender to the cold or despair. The blizzard showed no mercy. If anything, it grew stronger. The wind howled like something alive, hungry, furious. It tore at their clothes, their skin, their will. Snow piled up faster than they could move through it. In some places, it was waist deep, and they had to break trail like ships cutting through ice. Mitchell's sense of time dissolved. Had they been walking for 2 hours? 3? 4? It felt like days. It felt like forever. His mind started to play tricks on him. He saw lights that were not there, heard voices in the wind calling his name, saw his mother standing in the snow ahead, beckoning him forward. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the cold had sunk deep into his brain. Hypothermia affected thinking, he knew, made you confused, made you see things that were not there. He had to stay focused, had to keep his mind clear. He recited facts to himself. "My name is James Mitchell. I am from Columbus, Ohio. I am 24 years old. I am carrying a Japanese nurse through a blizzard. I will not give up. I will not die here." Over and over, like a mantra, keeping himself anchored to reality. The woman on his back whispered something in Japanese. He felt her lips move against his ear, but the words were lost in the storm. Was she praying? Saying goodbye? Thanking him? He wanted to tell her to hold on, that they were almost there, but he did not know if that was true. For all he knew, they were walking in circles, would die of exposure mere yards from safety. The thought was unbearable. The weight on his back was crushing. His legs threatened to buckle with every step. He thought about his mother back in Ohio, about Sunday dinners and warm kitchens, about the smell of apple pie and the sound of her laughter. He thought about how stupid it would be to survive combat, only to freeze to death on some godforsaken island carrying an enemy nurse. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he would not change his decision. This was who he was. This was what he believed in. Not glory, not medals, not winning at any cost, but in the fundamental value of human life, even enemy life, especially enemy life. Because if you could show mercy to the enemy, then maybe there was hope for the world after all. But he did not stop. None of them did. Davis stumbled and nearly dropped his woman, but caught himself at the last second, his knees hitting the snow before he pushed himself back up. Chen's face was white with frostbite, the skin on his cheeks and nose turning the pale color that meant tissue damage. But his grip on the rope never loosened. Kowalski moved like a machine, one foot in front of the other, his eyes fixed on Chen's back, following blindly because he no longer had the mental capacity to navigate. The nurses, those who could still walk, moved like automatons, one foot in front of the other, mechanical, determined. And then Yuki sang, softly at first, then louder, a Japanese song Mitchell did not recognize. But the melody carried through the storm, haunting and beautiful. The other nurses joined in, their voices thin but clear. It was a song about perseverance, about refusing to give up in the face of impossible odds. Mitchell did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It was a song that said, "We are still here. We are still alive. We will not surrender to the cold." And hearing that song, Hearing those voices refusing to be silenced by the wind, Mitchell felt something shift inside him. The exhaustion was still there, the pain, the cold. But beneath it, something stronger emerged, a determination not just to survive, but to make sure everyone survived. Not because they were Americans or Japanese, but because they were human. Because in this moment, on this frozen island, in this terrible storm, they were all just people trying to stay alive. And that was enough. Another woman fell. This time, she did not get up. She had been walking, putting one foot in front of the other, and then suddenly she was on the ground. No warning, no cry, just collapse. Yuki tried to lift her, but the woman was dead weight, unconscious, possibly worse. Mitchell stumbled over, still carrying his own burden. He checked for a pulse with numb fingers that could barely feel anything. It took him 3 tries to find it. It was there, faint but present, a flutter against his fingertips like a trapped bird. "We need to leave her," Kowalski said. His voice was hollow, empty of emotion. He had reached the point where survival trumped everything else. "We can't carry another. We're barely managing what we have. If we try to take her too, we all die." The words hung in the air. Terrible words. True words. Mitchell had been trained to make these calculations, to weigh one life against many, to make the hard choices that war demanded. Leave one to save 15. It was logical. It was practical. It was what any officer would order. Mitchell looked at the unconscious woman. She was young, maybe 19. Her face, despite the frostbite and malnutrition, still held traces of beauty. Black hair frozen stiff with ice, skin pale as snow, lips blue with cold. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, maybe someone's wife. In Japan, there was a family that loved her, that waited for her to come home. A mother who had waved goodbye, had packed her things, had cried when she left. A father who had been proud of his daughter's service. Maybe siblings, friends, a whole world of people who cared if she lived or died. But then he looked at Yuki. The old nurse was staring at him, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized. A test. Not of strength. She already knew they had that. Not of courage. They had proven that by coming this far. This was a test of character. A test of what they believed in, who they really were when everything was stripped away. Kowalski was right about the odds, but some things mattered more than odds. "We carry her," Mitchell said. His voice was firm, brooking no argument. Davis let out a bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "How? We can barely carry what we have. I've got no feeling left in my arms. Chen's about to collapse. Kowalski's running on fumes. We add another body. We're done." Mitchell was already shrugging off his pack, letting it fall into the snow. Everything in it, extra, ammo, rations, spare clothes, suddenly seemed worthless compared to a human life. "We take turns," he said. 10 minutes each. We rotate, we make it work. We've come this far. We're not leaving anyone behind. Not now." He hoisted the unconscious woman over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. She was surprisingly light, barely 80 pounds. The woman on his back shifted, her arms tightening around his neck as if she understood what was happening, as if she was trying to make herself lighter somehow. Now Mitchell carried 2. It was impossible. It was insane. The combined weight should have dropped him immediately, but he straightened, adjusted his grip, and took a step, then another. And somehow, his body found reserves he did not know he had. For the next mile, they passed the unconscious woman between them. Mitchell carried her for 10 minutes, then Davis, then Chen, then Kowalski, then back to Mitchell. Each rotation was agony. Each handoff was a small miracle that no one dropped her. They moved like machines, no longer thinking, just doing. Mitchell's world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next rotation. Nothing else existed. Not the cold, not the wind, not the doubt. Just the next step. The woman never woke, but her pulse remained steady. Yuki checked it every time they passed her, her cold fingers finding the vein at the wrist, counting silently. She would look up at Mitchell, hold up fingers to indicate the count, and nod. Alive. Still alive. That nod became the most important thing in Mitchell's world. It meant their impossible gamble was working. It meant that despite everything, despite the odds, despite the brutal mathematics of survival, they were winning. The blizzard began to ease. Not much. Just enough that Mitchell could see perhaps 10 yards ahead instead of 5. And then, through the swirling white, he saw it. A building. Dark, angular, man-made. The supply depot at the edge of the base perimeter. They had made it. Against all odds, against all probability, against every logical calculation that said they should have died hours ago, they had made it. Relief flooded through him, so intense it was almost painful. His legs nearly gave out. Tears froze on his cheeks, but he forced himself to keep moving, to close the final distance, to finish what they had started. The guard at the depot was a young private named Thompson, who nearly shot them when they emerged from the storm. Mitchell could not blame him. They looked like walking corpses, covered in snow and ice, barely recognizable as human. Their faces were white with frostbite, their clothes frozen stiff, their movements slow and mechanical. Thompson's eyes widened when he saw the women. His rifle came up, then down, confusion written across his face. "What the hell?" Mitchell cut him off, his voice barely above a croak. "Get the medics, now. And blankets, hot water, coffee. Everything you have. Move." The private ran. Inside the depot, they collapsed. Mitchell gently lowered the woman from his back, his shoulders screaming in relief as the weight came off. For a moment, he thought his legs would not support him, thought he would fall and not get up. But he locked his knees, forced himself to stand. The woman opened her eyes, looked at him, and whispered something in Japanese. He did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Thank you. Thank you for not leaving me. Thank you for carrying me through hell. Thank you for choosing life." Davis set down his woman with similar care, treating her like something precious and fragile. Chen and Kowalski did the same. The unconscious woman was laid carefully on the floor, and Yuki immediately began checking her vitals again. She pulled back the woman's eyelids, checked her pulse, listened to her breathing. After a moment, she looked up at Mitchell and smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It transformed her face, made her look years younger. "She lives," Yuki said in English. "You saved her. You saved us all." The medics arrived within minutes. They were professionals who had seen everything the war could throw at them, but even they looked shocked at the condition of the nurses. Severe hypothermia, frostbite, malnutrition, dehydration. One medic, a sergeant named Williams, examined Yuki and shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, I don't know how you're still walking. Your core temperature is 89 degrees. You should be dead." Yuki looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "Death is easy. Living is hard. We choose hard." It was a miracle any of them were alive. The medics worked quickly, efficiently. Blankets first, then warm liquids administered slowly to avoid shock. IV lines for the worst cases. Careful examination of frostbitten extremities. All 15 nurses would lose fingers or toes, some worse. But they would live. That was what mattered. They would live. The base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, arrived 30 minutes later. He stood in the doorway of the depot, surveying the scene. 4 of his soldiers barely conscious, 15 enemy women being treated by his medics, and the worst blizzard of the year still raging outside. He pulled Mitchell aside. "What happened out there?" Mitchell told him. "All of it. The discovery, the decision, the journey, every detail." Harrison listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. He was a career officer, West Point educated, a man who believed in regulations and protocol. When Mitchell finished, the commander was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the quiet voices of the medics working. Finally, Harrison spoke. "You risked 4 American lives to save 15 enemy prisoners, in a blizzard, against direct orders to return to base before the storm hit." Mitchell swallowed hard. This was it. This was where he would face court-martial for disobeying orders, for risking American lives, for doing exactly what any sane commander would say was the wrong thing. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. He did not try to justify it, did not make excuses. He had made his choice. He would live with the consequences. Harrison looked at him for a long moment, then at the women being treated, then back at Mitchell. Something shifted in the commander's expression. Maybe respect, maybe understanding, maybe just recognition of what it meant to be human. "Good," Harrison said finally. "That's exactly what you should have done. I'll be recommending you and your men for commendations. What you did out there was heroic, not because you fought the enemy, but because you saved them. That's the kind of men I want in my command, men who remember what we're fighting for." He turned to leave, then paused. "Get some rest, Corporal. That's an order." Mitchell wanted to argue that there was still work to do, people to check on, reports to file. But his body had other ideas. The adrenaline was gone. The exhaustion hit him like a truck. He sat down against the wall and was asleep before his head touched the wood. The nurses spent 3 weeks recovering at the base hospital. It was a strange time. The medical staff treated them with the same care they gave to American soldiers, something that confused and troubled the women. They had been taught that the enemy was subhuman, that capture meant torture and death. Yet here they were given warm beds, hot food, medicine, kindness. Doctors who worked to save frostbitten fingers and toes. Nurses who sat with them when they woke screaming from nightmares. It did not match the story they had been told their entire lives. Yuki, the oldest nurse, struggled the most with this contradiction. She had been a true believer in the imperial cause, had volunteered for Attu knowing it was likely a death sentence. She had served the emperor with pride, believing she was part of something glorious and necessary. But the reality of American treatment shattered her certainty, piece by piece. Every act of kindness was a hammer blow to the foundation of her beliefs. Every moment of respect was a crack in the wall of propaganda that had surrounded her for years. One day, an American nurse named Sarah brought her a cup of real coffee, not the bitter substitutes they had endured for years, but actual coffee made from real beans. The smell alone was overwhelming, a sensory memory of a life before war. Yuki held the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth seep into her cold fingers, smelling the rich aroma that seemed impossibly luxurious. And then she began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Years of pain, of loss, of holding everything together for the women under her care, all came pouring out. Sarah sat beside her, said nothing, just stayed present. She did not try to comfort with words, did not ask what was wrong. She just sat there, one hand on Yuki's shoulder, offering the simple gift of human companionship. That simple act of sitting with a crying enemy broke something in Yuki, some wall she had built around her heart. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to feel, to grieve, to question, to wonder if everything she had believed was a lie. The younger nurses adjusted more quickly. They were less entrenched in ideology, more flexible in their thinking. They laughed at American jokes they did not fully understand. They learned English phrases. "Thank you," "Please," "Good morning," "I am hungry." They marveled at the abundance of the base, the food that came in endless supply, the heat that worked every day, the electricity that never failed, the clean water that flowed from taps. Things that Americans took for granted seemed miraculous to women who had lived in a frozen bunker eating rats and melted snow. One nurse, Keiko, who had lost 3 toes to frostbite, told an American medic through a translator, "In Japan, we were told you were monsters, that you would defile us, torture us, parade us through streets for crowds to mock. But monsters do not carry their enemies through blizzards. Monsters do not share their coffee. Monsters do not sit with us when we cry. I do not know what you are, but you are not monsters." The medic, a young man from Iowa named Peterson, did not know what to say to that. He just nodded and went back to work, but her words stayed with him. Mitchell visited them once, a week after the rescue. He felt awkward, did not know what to say. What do you say to people you saved? What do you say to enemies who are not enemies anymore, who are just people who needed help? He stood in the doorway of the hospital ward, uncomfortable in his clean uniform, his hands shoved in his pockets. The nurses were scattered throughout the room, some in beds, some in chairs, all in various stages of recovery. When Yuki saw him, she immediately stood, then bowed deeply. The other nurses followed suit, those who could stand doing so, the others bowing from their beds. Mitchell, embarrassed, tried to wave them off. Please don't. You don't need to do that. I wanted to see how you were doing. But Yuki straightened and looked him in the eye. Her English had improved remarkably in just a week. You saved us, she said clearly. Not because we are American. Not because we are friends. You saved us because we are human. That is everything. That is what makes you different. That is what makes you better. You could have left us. The cold would have done your work for you, but you chose mercy. And mercy is the hardest choice of all. Mitchell did not know how to respond. He felt uncomfortable with praise, especially from people he still thought of, in some corner of his mind, as the enemy. He mumbled something about just doing his job, and left quickly, his face burning. But her words stayed with him. That night, sitting in the barracks with Davis, Chen, and Kowalski, he finally spoke about it. The four of them were alone, the other soldiers having gone to the mess, hall, or the rec room. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Did we do the right thing? Mitchell finally asked. The question hung in the air. I mean, they were the enemy. We could have died out there, all of us. For what? To save women who were trying to kill us a year ago? Does that make sense? Did we risk American lives for the enemy? It was the question that had been gnawing at him since they stumbled into base. The question he had not allowed himself to ask while fighting through the blizzard. The question that now demanded an answer. Davis, who had been quiet, looked up from the knife he was sharpening. Yeah, we did the right thing, and I'll tell you why. Because if we'd left them, we'd have been no different from the bastards we're fighting. What makes us different isn't our guns or our bombs. It's not our strategy or our tactics. It's that we don't leave people to die in the snow, even if they're the enemy, especially if they're the enemy. Because showing mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it, that's what separates humans from animals. Chen nodded slowly. His family history made his perspective unique. My family suffered under the Japanese, he said quietly. My uncle was killed in Shanghai. My grandmother starved to death during the occupation. I have every reason to hate them, and I do. I hate what they did. But those women in that bunker, they didn't do it. They were just trying to survive, just like us. And if I'd left them to die, I'd be no better than the soldiers who killed my uncle. Revenge is easy. Forgiveness is hard. But hard things are what make us human. Kowalski, the youngest, who had almost given up in the storm, spoke last. I wanted to leave that last woman, he admitted. When she collapsed, I thought, this is it. This is where we cut our losses and save ourselves. And I'm ashamed of that now, because Mitchell wouldn't let me. He made me be better than I wanted to be. And that taught me something, that our better nature is not something we have naturally. It's something we choose. And sometimes we need someone to remind us to make that choice. Sometimes we need someone to drag us toward being the people we should be. The nurses were eventually transferred to a POW camp in the mainland United States. Before they left, they insisted on saying goodbye to their rescuers. It was a formal ceremony, arranged by the base commander. The nurses lined up, each one bowing to each soldier. They gave small gifts, origami cranes folded from medical paper, tiny carved charms made from driftwood found on the beach, a song sung in their beautiful, haunting Japanese. These were women who had nothing, yet they found ways to give something back, to say thank you in the only way they could. Mitchell received a crane from Yuki. She pressed it into his hand and said, in English that had improved remarkably, "You gave me life. I can never repay, but I will remember, always, And I will teach my children about the American soldier who carried me through snow. I will tell them that enemies can become friends, that mercy is stronger than hate, that one man's choice can change everything. She bowed once more, and Mitchell, awkward as always with gratitude, bowed back. It seemed the right thing to do. The story did not end there. After the war, Yuki returned to Japan. She became a nurse again, working in hospitals that treated both Japanese and American patients. She never spoke about her time on Attu to anyone except her daughter, who she named Sarah, after the American nurse who had shown her kindness. It was a controversial choice in post-war Japan, giving a child an American name. But Yuki did not care about controversy. She cared about remembering the kindness that had saved her life. In 1965, 20 years after the war, Yuki traveled to the United States. It took her years to save the money, years to get the visa, years to overcome her fear of returning to the land of her former enemies. But she was determined. She had a promise to keep. She went to Ohio, to a small town outside Columbus, and knocked on a door. The house was modest, white with green shutters, a small garden in front, very American, very normal. The door opened. James Mitchell, now 45 years old, with gray hair and a slight limp from an old war wound, opened the door. He did not recognize the woman at first. She was older, grayer, dressed in a neat suit that looked expensive, but her eyes were the same. Those steady, determined eyes that had kept 15 women alive in a frozen bunker. "You carried me," she said simply, in English that was now fluent. "Through the snow. I never forgot. I promised myself that if I survived, I would find you, to say thank you, to show you that your mercy mattered." Mitchell stood there, stunned. He had thought about those nurses over the years, wondered what happened to them, hoped they survived. But he never expected to see any of them again. Slowly, he smiled. "Come in," he said. "Please, come in." They sat in his kitchen, drinking coffee, and talked for hours. About the war, about what came after, about how a single act of mercy can echo across decades. His wife brought cookies. His children, teenagers now, listened wide-eyed to stories of their father's war that they had never heard before. Yuki told him something she had never told anyone outside her family. In that bunker, before the Americans found them, the nurses had discussed suicide. They had a single pistol with 15 bullets, carefully hoarded for this purpose. They had been ready to use it. "You saved us from more than the cold," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us from ourselves, from the lie we had been told about honor. You showed us that real honor is not in dying for a cause. It is in choosing life, even when life is hard, especially when life is hard. You taught me that mercy is not weakness. It is the greatest strength of all." Mitchell did not know what to say. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He had just done what seemed right in the moment, what his conscience demanded. But listening to Yuki, watching her daughter Sarah translate for the parts her English could not reach, he began to understand that small acts of humanity in times of inhumanity are the things that matter most. Not the grand strategies, not the famous battles, not the medals and commendations, but the moments when someone chooses compassion over convenience, life over orders, mercy over revenge. Those are the moments that change the world. The other 3 soldiers had similar experiences. Davis became a teacher after the war, and he always told his students about the day he carried an enemy nurse through a blizzard. He made it the centerpiece of his lessons about World War II, because he believed that understanding war meant understanding not just the fighting, but the moments of humanity that survived despite the fighting. His students never forgot those lessons. Decades later, former students would write to tell him how that story had changed their perspective, had made them think differently about enemies and friends, about mercy and justice. Chen, who had watched his own family suffer under Japanese occupation, admitted that saving those women had been the hardest thing he ever did, but also the most important. "I learned that revenge is easy," he said in an interview years later. You just give in to hate, let it consume you, let it dictate your actions. But forgiveness? Forgiveness is hard. It requires you to see your enemy as human, to recognize that they suffer just like you suffer, that they love just like you love. And when you can do that, when you can show mercy to someone who has hurt you or someone you love, that's when you become more than just a survivor. That's when you become fully human. Kowalski, the youngest, who had almost given up in the storm, went on to join the Peace Corps after the war. He spent decades working in developing countries, always remembering that moment when he wanted to leave a woman in the snow, and Mitchell had told him no. That taught me something fundamental about myself, he said, that my first instinct isn't always my best instinct, that our better nature is not something we have naturally. It's something we choose, often in defiance of what seems logical or practical. And sometimes, we need someone else to remind us to make that choice, to push us toward being the people we should be, rather than the people fear and exhaustion make us want to be. The rescue of the Japanese nurses on Attu was not unique in World War II. There were countless other moments like it, small acts of mercy that happened far from cameras and reporters, unrecorded by history but no less real. American medics who treated enemy wounded even when their own men needed care. Japanese soldiers who shared water with captured Americans dying of thirst. German nurses who risked execution to hide. Jewish patients. Italian civilians who sheltered Allied prisoners. Soviet soldiers who spared German children. These stories do not fit neatly into narratives of good versus evil, of us versus them. They complicate our understanding of war by reminding us that even in the midst of terrible violence, humans are capable of extraordinary compassion. What makes the Attu story particularly powerful is how it challenged the expectations of everyone involved. The nurses expected death and received life. The soldiers expected to fight enemies and instead saved them. The military command expected the nurses to die in that bunker, and instead had to figure out what to do with 15 living, breathing prisoners who could not simply be filed away and forgotten. Every assumption was overturned, and in that overturning, something profound was revealed about human nature. That beneath the uniforms and flags and propaganda, we are all just humans trying to survive, trying to do right, trying to make sense of a world that often makes no sense at all. The Japanese nurses came from a culture that emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice unto death. They had been taught from childhood that surrender was shameful, that capture was worse than death, that the ultimate expression of loyalty was to die for the emperor. These were not empty words, but deeply held beliefs, reinforced by education, propaganda, and social pressure. Yet when faced with the reality of American mercy, they had to reconsider everything. Not immediately. That kind of transformation takes time. The beliefs of a lifetime do not vanish in a moment. But gradually, through the warmth of coffee and the care of medics, and the simple fact of being treated as humans rather than things, their worldview shifted. Similarly, the American soldiers came from a culture that had demonized the Japanese as cruel, inhuman, fanatic. Every propaganda poster, every newsreel, every story from the Pacific reinforced this image. The Japanese were portrayed not as people, but as vermin to be exterminated, as fanatics who could not be reasoned with, as enemies who deserved no quarter. Yet when Mitchell looked into that bunker and saw not demons, but terrified, starving women who asked for mercy in broken English, his training collided with his humanity. And humanity won, not easily, not without cost, not without doubt, but it won. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the story. In war, we are trained to see the enemy as other, as less than human, as fundamentally different from us. We have to, or we could not kill them. The human mind resists killing other humans. We are social creatures, wired for empathy and cooperation. To overcome that wiring, to make killing possible, we must convince ourselves that the enemy is not really human, not really like us, that their lives matter less than ours. that their suffering is justified while ours is tragedy. But that training is a lie, a necessary lie perhaps for the functioning of armies and the prosecution of wars, but a lie nonetheless. The enemy is human. They love and fear and hope just as we do. They have mothers who worry and children who wait for them to come home. They laugh at jokes and cry at funerals and dream of peace. They are someone's son or daughter, someone's mother or father, someone's friend or lover. When we forget this, we are capable of atrocities. When we remember it, we are capable of mercy. And mercy, as Yuki said, is the hardest choice of all, because mercy requires us to see the enemy as human, which means acknowledging that if circumstances were different, we could be them and they could be us. That recognition is uncomfortable, even painful, but it is also liberating, because it means that war is not inevitable, that enemies can become friends, that healing is possible. For decades, this story was forgotten. Mitchell never sought recognition. Neither did Davis, Chen, or Kowalski. They did not think what they did was special or deserving of attention. It was just the right thing to do, the human thing to do. They went home after the war, got jobs, raised families, lived quiet lives. They did not attend veteran reunions or give interviews or write memoirs. They were not interested in being heroes. They were just men who had done what their conscience demanded in a moment of crisis, and that was enough for them. The nurses, too, remained silent. In post-war Japan, being a POW carried shame. Many former prisoners never spoke of their experiences, hiding that part of their history from family and friends. The stigma of surrender, of capture, of survival when so many others died, it was too much to bear publicly. Yuki was one of the few who eventually shared her story, but only with family, only in private. She kept a diary from her time on Attu, written in tiny characters on scraps of paper. In it, she recorded everything: the cold, the hunger, the fear, the rescue, the kindness of strangers who had every reason to hate her. It was not until the 1990s, when historians began interviewing World War II veterans before they passed away, that the story came to light. A researcher named Margaret Chen, granddaughter of Private Chen, was recording her grandfather's memories when he mentioned the day he carried a Japanese nurse through a blizzard. She pressed for details. He was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the attention, worried that people would think he was bragging or exaggerating. But eventually, with his granddaughter's gentle persistence, he told her everything. The discovery of the nurses, the decision to rescue them, the harrowing journey through the blizzard, the moment when they stumbled into base barely alive. She tracked down the other soldiers, found their accounts, and then began the difficult work of finding the nurses. Most had died by then, time claiming what the war had not. But she found Yuki's daughter Sarah, who had her mother's diary. In it, written in Japanese in that careful, precise hand, was a detailed account of those months on Attu, the despair of the bunker, where they had prepared to die, the terror of hearing American voices outside, the shocking moment of mercy, when they were offered help instead of bullets, the blizzard that felt like it would never end, and the miracle of American soldiers who carried them to safety, who risked everything for women they had been trained to hate. "My mother never stopped being grateful," Sarah told Margaret. Every year on the anniversary of the rescue, February 18th, she would fold 15 paper cranes and pray for the men who saved her, one crane for each nurse. She taught me that hatred is easy, but forgiveness is divine. She taught me that our enemies are only enemies until someone chooses mercy. She taught me that one act of kindness can ripple forward through time, changing not just one life, but generations. I am here because an American soldier chose life over convenience. My children exist because of that choice, and we will never forget. The story, when it finally became public, struck a chord. In a world still divided by war and hatred, where old enemies and new ones dominated the news, here was evidence that mercy was possible even in the darkest circumstances, that humans could rise above their training, their prejudices, their fears, that the choice to save rather than kill, to help rather than harm, was always available even when everything argued against it. Veterans groups on both sides of the Pacific honored the memory of those involved. Former enemies met and shook hands and shared tears. A small monument was erected on Attu, though few people ever see it given the island's remoteness. You have to really want to get there, have to be willing to brave the same weather that nearly killed 19 people in 1944. But for those who make the journey, the monument is worth seeing. It shows two figures, one carrying the other through snow. No flags, no uniforms, no indication of nationality. Just two humans, helping each other survive. The inscription reads simply, "In the midst of war, mercy. In the face of death, life." February 18th, 1944. Nothing more is needed. What do we take from this story? Perhaps it is this, that our humanity is not something we lose in war, though war certainly tries to strip it from us. War dehumanizes by design, reducing complex humans to simple categories of friend and enemy, ally and threat. It trains us to override our natural empathy, to suppress our instinct for mercy, to do things that would be unthinkable in peacetime. But beneath that training, beneath the propaganda and the fear and the anger, our humanity remains. It does not disappear. It waits. And in moments of crisis, when everything is on the line, we have a choice about whether to let it emerge. Rather, our humanity is something we must fight to keep, must choose to express even when every circumstance argues against it. Mitchell and his men were exhausted, freezing, facing a deadly blizzard. They had orders to return to base. They had every practical reason to walk away, to report the nurses later, to let someone else deal with the problem. The easy choice, the rational choice, the choice that prioritized their own survival, was to save themselves. But they made the harder choice, the choice that risked everything, because they knew that if they walked away, they would lose something more important than their lives. They would lose their souls. They would lose the thing that made them human. The nurses, too, made a choice. They could have clung to their training, could have refused American help, could have chosen death over the shame of capture. They had been prepared for that choice, had a pistol and bullets ready for the purpose. Suicide was presented as the honorable path, the path that would preserve their dignity and their family's honor. But when Yuki bowed to Mitchell and asked for mercy, she was choosing life. She was choosing to trust, despite everything she had been taught, despite years of propaganda that painted Americans as monsters. That trust was an act of courage far greater than dying would have been. And in being rewarded, in being met with mercy instead of cruelty, it created a bridge between enemies that time could not destroy. Today, we live in a world that often feels as divided as it was in 1944. We are taught to fear the other, to see those different from us as enemies or threats. Political divisions feel insurmountable. Cultural differences seem unbridgeable. National interests appear incompatible. The rhetoric of war, us versus them, good versus evil, friend versus enemy, dominates our discourse. We draw lines and take sides, and forget that the people on the other side of those lines are just that, people, humans like us, with hopes and fears and dreams. Parents who love their children, children who trust their parents, people trying to do right in a complicated world. But stories like this remind us that the divisions are not as deep as they seem. That underneath the uniforms, the flags, the propaganda, the fear and the anger, we are all just humans, fragile, mortal, struggling to survive and make meaning in a difficult world. We all bleed. We all feel pain. We all love. We all grieve. We all hope for a better future. These fundamental commonalities do not disappear just because we are on opposite sides of a conflict. They remain, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for someone to be brave enough to see past the labels and recognize the human being underneath. The blizzard on Attu could have been the end for 19 people, 15 nurses and 4 soldiers. Instead, it became a testament to the power of mercy, a proof that our better nature can survive even the worst circumstances. a demonstration that the choice to help rather than harm is always available, even when everything argues against it. When Yuki died in 1998, at the age of 78, she was buried with a small origami crane, a match to the one she had given Mitchell 54 years earlier. Her daughter placed it in her hands, a symbol of life saved, of connections forged across impossible divides, of humanity preserved in the face of inhumanity. Mitchell attended the funeral. He was an old man by then, his body worn by time and war, his hair white, his hands trembling with age. But he traveled to Japan to say goodbye to the woman he had carried through the snow. The journey was difficult for him, both physically and emotionally. Returning to Japan meant confronting memories he had tried to bury, meant facing the reality of what war had cost everyone involved. But he went because some debts transcend nationality, because some connections cannot be broken by time or distance. At the ceremony, he placed his own crane next to hers. It was not as perfectly folded as hers. His hands were too stiff, his fingers too clumsy with age. But Sarah accepted it with a bow and tears, understanding the gesture's meaning. Two cranes, one made by a Japanese nurse, one made by an American soldier, resting together in the darkness. Two enemies who became something more than friends. Two humans who chose mercy when hatred would have been easier. It was, Mitchell said later to Margaret Chen, who had brought this story to light, the closing of a circle that began in a frozen bunker on the edge of the world. And so the story of the Japanese nurses and the American soldiers reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have a choice. We can choose cruelty or compassion, revenge or mercy, hatred or understanding. We can choose to see others as enemies or as humans. We can choose to let our fears and prejudices dictate our actions, or we can choose to rise above them. 4 soldiers chose compassion in a blizzard. 15 nurses chose to accept it. And that choice, made in an instant but echoing across decades, proves that the best of humanity survives even the worst that humanity can do. The measure of our humanity is not in what we do when it's easy, but in what we choose when everything argues against it, when we are tired and cold and scared, when helping costs us something, when mercy seems foolish and hatred seems justified. Those are the moments that define us. Those are the choices that echo through time, changing not just individual lives, but the trajectory of history itself. Because every act of mercy, no matter how small, is a vote for a better world. Every choice to help rather than harm, to save rather than kill, to forgive rather than revenge, these choices accumulate, build on each other, create ripples that spread far beyond what we can see. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that mercy is possible even in impossible circumstances, if it gave you hope that humans can rise above their worst instincts to express their best, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories from history are not just about the past. They are about who we are, who we can be, and what we are capable of when we choose our better nature over our baser instincts. They are reminders that we face similar choices every day, maybe not as dramatic as carrying someone through a blizzard, but no less important. How we treat the stranger, how we respond to those who disagree with us, how we choose to see the other, as enemy or as human. History is full of forgotten moments of grace like this, waiting to be remembered. Stories of enemies who became friends, of hatred overcome by compassion, of small acts that changed everything. By sharing them, we keep alive the memory of those who chose compassion over convenience, life over orders, mercy over revenge. And in remembering them, we remind ourselves that we can make the same choice, that the capacity for mercy lives in all of us, waiting to be expressed. That even in the darkest times, even when everything seems hopeless, the choice to be human remains. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for giving your time and attention to these men and women who, in the depths of war, proved that humanity endures. Thank you for remembering James Mitchell, who refused to leave anyone behind. Thank you for remembering Yuki, who chose life over honor. Thank you for remembering Davis, Chen, and Kowalski, who followed Mitchell into the storm. Thank you for remembering the 14 other nurses whose names have been lost to history, but whose lives mattered. And thank you for choosing to be part of a community that believes these stories matter, that believes remembering is an act of resistance against the forces that would have us forget our common humanity. Until next time, remember this: the measure of our humanity is not in what we do when it's easy, but in what we choose when everything argues against it. When the world says hate, we can choose compassion. When circumstances say abandon, we can choose to carry. When fear says turn away, we can choose to stay. These choices are available to us every day, in small ways and large. And every time we make them, we honor the memory of those who came before us, who showed us what it means to be truly human. Every time we choose mercy over cruelty, we add one more chapter to a story that began in a frozen bunker on a forgotten island, and continues wherever humans choose to see each other, not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on this brief and precious journey through life. Stay human. Choose mercy. Remember that our enemies are only enemies until someone decides they are not, and that someone can be you.